Developing Thinking Managers to Bridge the Engagement Gap, hosted by HRDQ-U and presented by Hermann-nehdi. Today's webinar will last around 1 hour. If you have any questions, you can always type them into the questions box. We will be answering questions as they come in live at the end of the presentation or as a follow-up by email. My name is Sarah Schaefer, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Hermann-nehdi is CEO of Hermann International and creator and trailblazers of whole brain thinking and the Hermann Brain Dominance Instrument, and is also the co-author of the Whole Brain Business book. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today, Anne.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm delighted to be here and to discuss a topic that I think continues to be top of mind for most of the organizations that we work with around the globe. Happy Earth Day to all who are joining in. I see we still have people joining in. You'll note on the slide that's up, and we will be putting this in the answer box for you, a link to a landing page where you will be able to get a copy of a distribution version of the deck that I'll be using today. So don't worry about having to write a whole lot of things down because you will get access to that after today's session. So we'll be looking at a few key items today as I do have a very specific agenda, and I'm going to see if I can get this to advance. Yes, today's agenda is really to first start doing just kind of a brief check-in. Where are we on this engagement thing? We've been talking about it for a very long time, and share some recent updated stats and insights that I've collected. We'll look at 4 challenges and drivers of engagement that comes out of some very recent research. We'll look at how you engage the whole brain way. And engagement and the brain go naturally together because conceivably everyone who is in your organization is a thinker and they all have brains, and part of our challenge is engaging those brains. And then finally, very specific keys to individualizing engagement for managers, which is one of the key takeaways that we have. I see a question popping up about getting access to the presentation, and we'll put a link in the answer box for you to do that. So one of the things I wanted to start off with this, I saw this cartoon and I was doing some preparation for today's session, and I thought it was interesting. It referred to employee engagement and somebody saying, gee, we'd like you to take a few moments to complete this survey, and the person's like, oh no, not another engagement survey. So we might actually be surveying people so much that we're moving from employee engagement to employee enragement. Let's hope that that's not the case. But we're clearly collecting more and more data on this, and I think the good news about that is that we're able to better understand what some of those key levers are and key drivers that will help actually move the needle. And when we look at whether or not this is still top of mind for senior leaders, a recent report by Burson Deloitte, highly recommend you check it out if you haven't, called Leading in the New World of Work. If you just Google that, you'll be able to pull it up. Looked at what they considered to be, and this is a very large global leader survey, important in terms of trends to business, looking at some of the classic HR and learning issues that we are often looking at, and talent issues. And culture and engagement was right at the top. And if you look at the column on the right, it was also considered very important, just slightly under leadership gaps, but right up at the top in terms of being most important or very important. So, and I think the fact that they've got culture and engagement together is not a surprise because I believe that they are interconnected. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we continue to explore this topic. Now, I'd like to start with a poll, and I'm going to launch this poll. I'd like you to be thinking about this right before I launch it. I'm curious about what your current approach to employee engagement is. Do you have formal approaches in place with full leadership support? Do you have formal approaches in place with limited leadership support? Are you more informal in your approach, but you still have leadership support to move to formal? Or do you have only informal approaches with very little leadership support? So I'm going to launch this. You're going to need to pick just one. So if you would, go ahead and I see all of you are jumping right in. Really appreciate that. Great. We appreciate you jumping in and doing this quickly so that we get the results and be able to share those. Great. About half of you voted, so those of you who are still pondering, if you would make a selection, that would be fantastic. Okay. Very interesting data emerging. And if you are an independent consultant, you might think about the organization, one of the organizations that you're working with, if you feel like you're seeing a trend out there. Great. Getting ready to close the poll. I'm going to go ahead and close it and then share the data. And very interesting as you look at what we've got here. So 35% if you said you have informal approaches with leadership support to move to formal, which is, I think, very exciting. Then 29% formal approaches with full leadership support. That's great. Next in line was only informal approaches with not a lot of leadership support to move to more. That's 22%. And then finally, formal approaches with limited leadership support, 14%. We did this with a group at HR.com some months ago. And interestingly enough, in that particular audience, the largest percentage was only informal approaches with no leadership support for more, to a larger degree, closer to 40%. But similar data across also informal approaches with leadership support to move to formal. And only 16% of them had a formal approach with leadership support. So it sounds like many of you are working with some degree of leadership support. But if you look at the no leadership support category, we're looking at quite a few of you who are trying to put this in place, and about 36% are saying, over a third, gee, we don't have quite the leadership support we want. So I think that's important to recognize as we look at moving forward and how we can actually build that support. And part of that is by building the business case. And clearly the business case, there's tons of data today that allows us to look at that business case. Here's some recent data points. Value engagement to improve company performance. This is Towers-Watson. Low engagement firms had a shareholder value that was 44% below the average. So low engagement really does hit the core essence of what is important to most organizations. High engagement firms had a shareholder return that was 19% higher than average. Just incredibly impressive. So when we look at, there are some data points that we can bring to bear if you're looking for leadership support. I think one of the best ways to do that is to demonstrate and share the ROI associated with this in terms of the business results. Again, this is a CEB data point. Companies that have highly engaged employees enjoy 2.5 times more revenue than their lower engaged peers, so that's a top-line measure. Certainly impressive. Hard to debate whether or not that's important for most organizations today. And employees with low engagement, and I think this is really kind of scary, 4 times more likely to have their employees leave than those with high engagement. And we know how costly that can be, and certainly it impacts us in financial ways as well. Just the U.S. number for the cost of employee turnover is $11 billion annually. And when you look at that, we have all sorts of ripple effect costs that come from that, and an impact on our growth and our ability to then, especially with some of the talent shortages that are out there, then we're really scrambling to try to make up for that turnover. So there are certainly quite a few data points, and when we look at where do we stand in terms of our ability to do this engagement work, there are several companies that measure this, and some of these surveys happen every few years, some of them happen annually, and you can see that when we look at the engaged workforce, about a third are engaged, they're connected, they're positive, they give above and beyond. And interestingly enough, when we look at the Gallup data, that's 2014 data, that number has actually gone up slightly. In 2013, it was 29%, so it's gone up a few percentage points, which is very encouraging. Partially engaged, it's kind of scary that about half, or a little less than half, are partially engaged. Now, this doesn't mean that somebody's not a good employee. It means that, that they kind of do what they're asked to do, go home, and really are sustainers, but not necessarily growers of the organization. And so that's a critical group, because that's a group we want to move up into the engaged category, but they also are subject to getting moved down to the next category, which is actively disengaged. And when we look at the Gallup data, the partially engaged, actually, we saw a slight drop from previous data, where it was closer to 54% in 2013. So we're seeing that drop a little bit and the engaged go up just slightly. But also in actively disengaged, which is really, these are the folks who sometimes actually kind of go out of their way to undermine some of the effects. If they have a negative impact and can certainly influence others, especially those partially engaged, we have between a fifth and a quarter of our populations, and that has just actually gone slightly up from 2013. It was at 17%, now 17.5. So, when we look at the data, we're making a little bit of progress, but not as much as we currently really would hope to get. And I think that's part of the challenge as we look at what we're trying to do. Raise your hand if you would, if you agree. There should be a little hand on your toolbar there. If you are seeing improvement in terms of the engagement and those that you're working with. So if you would just raise your hand if you are seeing some improvement, and I'll take a quick scan to see how many hands are up. And we have, quite a few, but certainly not a large percentage of people saying that they're seeing a huge degree of improvement. And I think that is, again, part of the challenge, and perhaps it's part of why you're on today's webinars, to look at how we can improve. So we'll talk about that. Now, I saw a recent HBR article, which is referenced here, which you might want to take a look at, about what great managers are doing to engage employees. This is from some folks at the Gallup organization, one of the groups that's doing the surveying that we just shared. Their research shows that managers account for as much as 70% of the variance in employee engagement scores. 70%. That's a huge variable. So that's why looking at that manager role is so important. There are other variables that come into play, but we're going to talk primarily about that manager role because I think that's a place where I believe our profession also can help move the needle. So let me just ask you, what are your biggest challenges for your managers in creating employee engagement? And we're going to launch this poll in just a minute, but what I would like to do is have you think about it before we launch. Is it inadequate communication with employees by managers? Is there just not enough communication? Insufficient clarity of expectations from managers. I'm just not sure what I'm supposed to be doing. Ineffective performance reviews, where the focus is primarily negative. Or is it lack of manager ability to help employees develop in the future? So pick the number one that you think is impacting you most. I'm going to go ahead and launch that. We'll see what your data comes in to say. This is some recent information that comes from some of Gallup's data that talks about critical drivers. So I see many of you are jumping right in and voting. Thanks much for doing that. I think this data can be important for all of us to understand. It also helps frame up maybe your thinking as we talk about some of these solutions, about what you might be able to do to have the greatest possible impact that you can have. Okay, we've got about 2/3 have voted. I'll let a few more people get those votes in, which is a great way to share data, not only for yourself, but also for others who are here to kind of see what's going on. Okay, so we'll close this out, and I'll go ahead and share the data. So interesting, as we look at this, you see that 36% inadequate communication with employees by managers. Not surprised by that. I think that is becoming a huge challenge. Interaction is a big requirement for managers, and they're so busy that I think it's often what falls to the bottom of the stack. Next, 33%, lack of managers' ability to help employees develop in the future. And this may be a time issue, but sometimes it's a skill issue. Sometimes it's a combination of issues. They might not know about what those development needs might be. I think we can certainly help in that arena. 19% insufficient clarity of expectations from managers. And clearly, I think there are things that we can do to help managers be clearer and more articulate in sharing those with employees. And then finally, ineffective performance reviews were focused as the negative 13%. That's great to see that we're not having that issue, although I think there's still some folks out there who believe that that's the case, 13% of you. So when you flip these around, you realize that, in fact, they represent 4 drivers of engagement. So if those are challenges that you're facing, when you look at the data, an important driver is really a focus on strength-based performance indicators. Really having the review process be focused on what is it that I bring to the table and how can I do that better. And there's also a lot of additional data that allows us to understand that employees really want to be doing work that they feel they can do well. And so I think there was a trend for so many years to focus on the negative. We've kind of 360'd people to death with all sorts of data on what's not working. So really having an opportunity to think about how they can leverage their strengths, not to blindsight against those things that are challenges, but that's really, I think, a critical factor, and that's one key driver. Clarity of expectations is another key driver. So what are you doing to help your managers be clearer in how they are articulating those expectations? How are they holding people accountable? What systems do you have in place to facilitate that? Might be an interesting thing for you to explore. Frequent and varied communication, a big complaint in terms of, I'm only getting a lot of email. I don't actually have one-on-one conversations. And that connects back to that performance piece because in many instances, there's just not enough live time with managers. But having that communication on a regular basis and those performance conversations on a regular basis is clearly something that we're seeing in the data will help drive engagement. And then finally, this focus on future development, which is so critical because we know that many employees, especially millennials, are not interested in a 25-year career with their organizations. They may only be there for a few years, and they really want to know, how are you going to contribute to my development? And if I'm going to stay here and be engaged and not opt out for a better offer somewhere else, I need to understand that, and I need great clarity around that. So thank you for providing that data. And I think these 4 key areas are areas, if one of them is very strong for you, you might want to look at going there first because there's data to substantiate that this will help drive greater engagement. So another HBR article, very recent, in January of this year, asked this question: what are we doing wrong? I thought it was a really interesting question because it's not as if we haven't been paying attention to this. Companies are spending over $720 million each year on employee engagement. And in fact, we're projecting that that's going to rise to $1.5 billion. Yet employee engagement is still not growing at the rate we want it to be growing. We saw a tiny bit of improvement there, especially in those, in the partially engaged and engaged, but not enough to really get us to where we want to be, especially for the amount of money we're spending on this. And it was interesting what the conclusions that they came to. And I think it's interesting is most employee engagement models are centered around the work experience and not on the employees themselves, really understanding what employees want. And really only talking about work-related or experience-related, but not the employee themselves. So I think this notion of understanding the actual individuals out there and how do managers engage specifically with people is data that we need to be focusing on. And I thought this was really an interesting way to begin to explore this particular issue. And, I think I see a comment here about it focusing on development for older employees. I didn't mean to say earlier that with millennials, the focus should not only be focused on them. I think the development has to cross all generations. What I do know, though, is that there is a big sensitivity in the millennial age group to this notion of development, perhaps even more so, and they may be quicker to jump ship than others, but development is important across all generations, and thanks for bringing up that comment. That was certainly important to clarify. So as we look at this idea of how do we focus on the employee, Let's define what we mean by engagement. I think that's important, and I know that this, there's a lot of stuff out there about it, but I think we can define it in a pretty simple way. I think if we're focusing on the employee, how do we win the hearts and minds of employees in ways that inspire them to deliver high performance? How do we win the hearts and minds of employees in ways that inspire them to deliver high performance? We have to work in a way that works for them. Because ultimately, when we see high engagement, what it means is that they are doing what needs to be done because they want to do it, not because the organization wants them to do it. Doing what needs to be done, and often more than what needs to be done. And to get that more piece, we've got to really unhook what it is that they want and link into that that piece. And we know from research that I've seen out there, and I think it continues to be true, when we begin to ask employees what they're looking for, they're really looking to do what they're good at, so they want a fit in terms of their abilities. They want to do things that matter, and so they want to feel like they are making a contribution and want to understand what that contribution is. They, as we just said, want to be doing something that drives them forward in their career. Again, to the point made earlier, irrespective of where they are in that career. And then finally, they want to have passion about what they're doing. So that notion of looking for ways that we can do this in a way that inspires them to deliver the performance, I think, is really key. Now, it all starts with an awareness that people, again, are different. So if we start talking about, well, how do we understand what is going to inspire them, it is a bit of a challenge because we know from our research, and we've been doing this for 30 years, that people have different thinking preferences, and those preferences will impact a wide array of aspects of who they are at work, how they show up at work, and what they care about at work. And when we know that everyone processes information differently, different people are going to need different things to feel like they are heard, to feel like they're being engaged. So we need to go in with the assumption that this is complex, that it's not one size fits all. And even though I'm preaching to the choir, because I know those of us in our profession know that, I think it's important to remind our leaders and our managers of that. And our model serves as a way to help us begin to understand some of those differences, and specifically how our brains need to be engaged in a way that is most relevant to each of those unique employees that you're dealing with. And the whole brain model, which came out of research that we did over 30 years ago at GE, looking at neuroscience and then translating that into key indicators that cluster together into this model, help us begin to describe in ways that are most important what we can do to really have the greatest possible impact on a wide array of folks. So if you look at that logical, analytical, fact-based, quantitative aspect, you may actually feel that that represents some of your thinking. And engaging with a person who's got strong preferences in that area means that they actually want the bottom line, and they'd like to be able to have data, and they want to understand exactly how they are contributing in a very concrete way. The organized, sequential, planned, and detailed green perspective really is going to want that clarity of expectation and really understand the structures and processes needed to get there. That red, interpersonal, feeling-based, kinesthetic, more emotional perspective is really going to be focusing more on that communication and that interpersonal engagement with their manager. And then finally, that holistic, intuitive, integrative, synthesizing perspective is going to have that future focus, look at the big picture, and really want to understand how they fit and how they're contributing to the whole. Now, we know from our research that 95% of the population actually has preferences for two or more of these. So we're not single individuals where we're kind of relegated to one quadrant. We have preferences across all of these different areas, and all of us have access to all four. So this makes the manager's challenge particularly interesting because we need to be able to speak multiple languages when we're engaging. We may not always have data on the preferences of those that we're trying to engage. And so this puts a requirement on our managers to really broaden their spectrum of thinking and be able to look at, well, how might I communicate to someone who's got more blue-green oriented preferences, provide them with data and structure, or more blue-yellow, help them understand the big picture and give them specific goals within that big picture, or red-yellow being more oriented, well, I understand, where we're headed, but how do I best engage you in that direction? Or green-red together, which might be more about, okay, let's understand specifically what it is that you need from me, and then let's look at specific processes that we can build to get there and how I can support you. So let's take a look at digging into this a little bit further so that you can begin to understand how you can walk away from today's session using it. So we've got these different thinking preferences, and one of the things that, that we know is that for managers to individualize engagement, there are really 5 things that they need to do really well. They need to own their own preferences. That is a big piece of the puzzle because their preferences are going to impact how they engage with others. So they first need to understand what they are and own the responsibility and accountability for those. They need to value other preferences. They need to stretch to meet the needs of others, align, and coach. And I'm seeing several comments about how, gee, this is a little bit like situational leadership. This is a little bit like personality assessments like DISC or Myers-Briggs. Let me give you a quick frame of reference to think about. So there are many models out there. Personality assessments really look at who we are from a personality perspective, and in many instances that's for many people kind of hardwired, and it's pretty much who we are. DISC and 360s and other assessments look at behavior, and behavior tends to be quite situational, so it's got a strong external component. The whole brain model looks at the cognitive picture of how we're processing information and our thinking. And much of what we do at work today is thinking, and much of what we're asking people to do, make decisions, solve problems, is thinking-based. So none of these is mutually exclusive. You get different data points, but the whole brain model allows you to begin to understand how you are engaging the brain, so to speak, of that person. And we know from our data that you can shift your thinking if you're conscious. And so your preferences are your first frame of reference, but we can change and shift our thinking as required when we're aware of those preferences. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, and social styles is another behavioral model as well. So thanks for bringing that up. There are many models out there, and that helps differentiate behavior, personality, and cognitive, and we fall in the cognitive domain. So own, value, stretch, align, and coach. And we'll dig into each of those so you can better understand what that means. And I'm going to start and get personal. Let's talk about you, because I think this makes a lot more sense when we think about ourselves first. And just raise your hand if you have actually or are currently in a situation where you are managing someone or leading someone. So just raise your hand if that's something that you've either done or are doing currently, so that we can get a sense. I mean, this is certainly going to be relevant for, I think, most people on the call. We have most of you are in a position where you are either have led or are leading, or may in the future raise your hand if you think you will be leading someone in the future and providing that. Okay, so first and foremost, let's think about you. How can you better own and be accountable for your thinking preferences? This is a big piece of the puzzle for managers. And that requires that we first of all understand how we think, and we can focus on the strengths as a way to begin to get started there with a strengths-based approach. So take a look at what you see on the screen, and as you look at that, you'll see that there are these 4 quadrants, and somebody's saying, gee, is this right brain and left brain? That initial research looking at the left brain and the right brain, left being more blue-green, right being more yellow-red, is clearly going to align with these. However, we want to be really careful, because left brain, right brain implies to many people that it's an either-or construct, and we know that the brain is designed to be highly integrated and interconnected. So yes, absolutely, this comes from some of that initial research, but takes it a step further to look at whole brain. So take a look at what you've got here, and you might think about each of these different quadrants And you yourself, as you think about your role and your role in engagement, are you all about theories and facts and looking at logical processes and excited about doing critical analysis and a more of a blue perspective? Is that really how you like to kind of take a look at this issue of engagement or learning or the other areas of focus that you might have? Is it more about getting very practical, looking at consistency and processes, getting organized around how do we actually execute this, and being very, very clear and having clear expectations and processes to execute against that? Perhaps that's your preference. Or maybe you're more about really understanding the people side of this, very good at sharing, teaching, engaging others, and understanding the emotional elements, the values components of this. That would be more red. Or finally, the yellow, really big picture, trying to think about the organization-wide implications of this, understanding new ideas and concepts, often looking for new and innovative ways to actually execute and solve this particular issue. So as we look at that, you might think about how you are best engaged. Do you get most convinced by results, precision and analysis, details, practicality and a plan, passion, shared values and empathy, or new ideas, room to play and vision? So I'm going to invite you to just do a quick poll, and we'll see what that means for you. So we're going to go ahead and open this up, and let's just take a look at what your strongest preferences are. Convince me with values and empathy, details, practicality, a plan, results, precision and analysis, and new ideas, room to play, and a vision. So let's take a quick look at that, because I think this is going to impact how you go about helping this bridge the gap with this engagement issue, what you're going to pay most attention to. Great. I see you're jumping in. Some of you have already, there you go. Yeah, and a question about quadrants tied to Strength Finder for domains. I can talk about that maybe towards the end of our time together if we can. There's a question about, is there an assessment that goes with this? There is actually an assessment that was mentioned in the introduction. We have an assessment that came out of that initial EEG research that was done called the HBDI, the Hermann Brain Dominance Instrument, which most of our research is based on. Over 2 million people in our current database, and some of the data I'll be sharing with you. So great, we've got many of you have finished here, so let's share the data. And take a look, and you see that's interesting. 36% convinced me with new ideas, rooms to play. So that means that you're going to be interested in the big picture and innovative ways to do this. Then next, 33%, the details, practicality, a plan. And so that's going to be very, very important. What are the processes that you need to put in place? And then a tie between shared values and empathy at 16% and results, precision, and analysis at 16%. Now, you might just take a moment and look at, okay, what would your boss or your external client, what would they need to get buy-in to an engagement process? So just type in blue, green, red, or yellow into the question box. What do you think your boss would need for this? Because I think our preferences have an impact. But what do you think your boss would need? Go ahead and type that into the question box, and let's see if it's different than what your preferences might be, then raise your hand. So go ahead and type in lots of blue and green coming in there, tons of green, results, results, results. A few have a little bit of yellow popping in there. It's situational, so some of you may have some situational. Okay, a little bit of red, but just tons of blue and green coming up. And many of you are raising your hand saying, oh my gosh, but this is so different than my perspective. So it's important to understand your perspective on this, because the way you go about getting that leadership buy-in has a lot to do with how you position what it is that you're going to do. So keep that in mind as we talk about this. It's not only about the managers, but it's also about you, and that's why I wanted to share this with you. Now, as we look at that, one of the questions that came up just a moment ago was, well, gee, can your HBDI preferences change over time? Yes, they can, but it's not a casual change. And so what we found is that that our preferences stay pretty much stable unless we've had a major change in our life, major job change, career change, or life change. So we know that 63% of employees say their manager has a direct influence on their satisfaction and engagement. So not only is this relevant to you, it's relevant to every manager that you work with. And managers have to own the implications of their preferences because that will impact how they engage. It'll impact what they think is important. Often we engage the way we like to be engaged, right? I know I worked with somebody for years who just said to me, well, you know, I don't understand why this person is coming in sharing all this detail. I'm just drowning in detail, and it drives me crazy, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time providing them with detail. Huge disconnects from a very big picture leader and their direct report who brought a whole lot of green perspective. And that individual felt completely disengaged, did not feel like they were getting any kind of recognition for the work that they were doing. And until they began to understand this dynamic, they wasted a lot of time and energy on it. So when you're looking at making that engagement pitch, lots of times what we know is that people are experiencing these differences every day. And in many instances, teams are part of the way we experience this on a daily basis, and we know that everybody's different, and that crops up in teams quite a bit. Together, everyone annoys me. And so, you know, we have an opportunity to move that annoyance of difference into something that is a critical shift, which is to value difference. Those annoyances show up in terms of frustrations. So take a moment to think about what frustrates you most. And again, in the spirit of understanding what managers might need to learn, what frustrates you most? So take a look at, is it, you know, does it really drive you crazy when there's a lack of facts or data in the blue? If things are hopping around and there's not enough clarity around practical implementation, is that going to irritate you in green? If it's really insensitive or there's not enough time for really a people orientation, will that make you crazy in red? Or if it's just too big picture. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this and have you share what it is that frustrates you the most. So let's go ahead and do that. Go ahead and place your vote. What is it that frustrates you the most? And again, keep in mind that this, again, is something that our managers will also be experiencing. In some instances, it's our strengths that get in the way. In other instances, it's our frustrations. I knew a manager who was so frustrated that as soon as a person showed up in their chat box or in a live situation at the threshold of their cubicle, they basically shut down. It was like, oh no. And frustrations do that. They shut us down. So go ahead. I'm going to let you finish up your votes. I've got a lot of people voting here. All right. Give you one or two more seconds to put your votes in. Okay. Great. I'm going to close it out. Very good. And we'll share the data. Okay. So you get, you know, many of you are going to get frustrated. Again, equal opportunity frustration. And I define frustration as unmet expectations. So getting very clear about what those expectations are is a direct antidote to the frustration that people feel. And we heard that earlier in the data around the importance of being clear around expectations. So again, that's going to be a critical factor in terms of looking at what we're doing and what we need to do. So as we look at that data, managers can understand, adapt, and harness. You can. All of our research on the brain shows that we can shift our thinking. Great question here about, have we seen value in teams sharing their dominant styles with each other? Absolutely. In fact, we have data that shows that the teams that have that data and have been able to understand how different they are using their thinking style preferences can see an increase of up to 66% more effectiveness in their output. And it's because they understand that why people are coming at it from a different perspective, number one. Number two, they can own their own preferences. And number three, they can adopt their language, right? So great question, and that's certainly something that we have seen out there. So valuing. We talked about valuing the thinking preferences of others and their strengths is really important. You know, you might say, well, think different, but not different from me. And I love that comment I just saw, which is, well, it's better, frustrating me is better than angering me. And I think that notion of really heading into this notion, how do we help managers begin to value thinking preferences? And when they begin to understand that different occupational categories will bring different thinking preferences to bear. Here you see some sample HPDI profiles that clearly show the strongest area in the color as the strongest preference, and you get a sense of some of the different functional categories. And so as you work across functions, you need to be prepared that you will have different engagement challenges with your managers. They're going to be looking at engagement differently. You're going to want to be talking to them about it differently, and they're going to be more comfortable using some of these strategies than others. They may need more coaching in an area of red if they tend to be more naturally blue-oriented or blue-green-oriented in their thinking. They may not really be comfortable with the future conversations if that's something that does not come as naturally to them. So very important to keep that in mind as you look at this notion of valuing preference and how we can help them do that more effectively. Now, as we look at stretching, that is one thing that there's great research now that shows that we can shift our mindset. If you're not familiar with Carol Dweck's work on mindset, we know from her research that, first of all, you have to believe that you can shift your thinking. If you don't believe you can shift your thinking, that'll get in your way. But we can change people's opinions. And once you believe you can shift your thinking, you actually can. And so setting the stage for an understanding that your thinking can shift is the first step towards stretch. And I think that stretch piece is part of the reality of this engagement issue. It's the only way we're going to get there is by having managers understand that they do need to stretch and that, in fact, they need to develop thinking agility. And the way we define thinking agility is the ability to deliberately and consciously adapt and shift your thinking when and as the situation requires it. So deliberately and consciously, those are two critical words. So once you believe that you can do it, then you need to very intentionally, that takes effort, it takes energy. Managers need to understand that this is part of their responsibility, and in order to get their teams better engaged, they need to be agile. They need to shift their perspective to better meet the needs of the perspective that, that others are providing and needing from them. And so as you look at that, think about ways that you look at your thinking agility as you're looking at how to get engagement better bought into in the organization. I believe, and I'm hearing so much buzz and demand for thinking agility out there in the marketplace, and I think it's because our work now requires it almost at every level of the organization, but certainly of managers. Managers need to engage their whole brains. You know, we can kind of even joke about it. We're looking for someone who can stretch with the demands of this job. Are you flexible? So in some ways, we all have to kind of be Gumby. Yeah, and this is, you know, situational management, situational leadership. We've been talking about this for many years, and I agree with many of you who are making that comment. It's but situational thinking, and one of the things that I think is interesting is when you give people the knowledge that first of all they have preferences, but next that they actually can shift their thinking beyond those preferences and not be a prisoner of those preferences. It gives them ownership and accountability, and also a very non-judgmental way to talk about what it is that they can and need to do. And I think that's one of the reasons why a brain-based approach is so appealing to so many organizations. So as we look at engaging through communication, one of the ways they can stretch is just by thinking about how they communicate. And we talked earlier about you and what you needed for better communication. So if you're looking at needing results, precision, and analysis, there are very specific things that you want to focus on when you're communicating. And we saw how important communication can be. If it's details, practicality, and a plan, you're going to want to be providing that in a step-by-step kind of an approach and stay on task. If you're looking at passion and values, you want to really look at how you can express and engage people in a way that they feel heard. And then finally, new ideas, room to play, and vision. You know, use metaphors, visuals, other ways to communicate that will engage. Everybody is really looking for what they need, just as you want to be engaged in a way that best fits your needs. So do the employees that are and managers that are working with them, and they need to understand how to do this. And almost everybody can do this, unless they're just dead set against it and have decided that they won't. So it's a question of providing them with the tools that they need. I love this quote by Oliver Wendell Holmes: "A mind that is stretched by new experience can never go back to its old dimensions." And everything that's out there in brain research shows us that our brains are what they call plastic. They're malleable. So that's the good news. It's a message of hope for all of us, and that is that we can stretch our thinking. But I think many people may assume that that's just not something that they can do, or that they're hardwired a certain way, and they might actually use that as a cop-out instead of taking that time and energy to think about how they can stretch to meet the needs of those they're trying to engage. So finally, once you've stretched, managers need to find ways to align the work with the preferences and the employees with the initiatives that they're working on. And this issue of alignment, I just finished updating the Whole Brain Business book, which will be released in May, and very excited about this book. We did tons of research to look at and study the over 2 million people we have in our database, and really provide specific tools and tips and learnings from our 30 years of research, so with a big focus on practicality. One of the things that we discovered as part of that process, and we have a whole chapter on this, is this issue of alignment of work preferences. And I mentioned earlier that people want to feel like they are doing something that they're good at and that matters and that they have passion around. And we don't always have full control of this, but I think managers, one of the ways they can really improve some of this engagement is to begin to look at how is that fit, is there alignment, where is there misalignment. We had an interesting example working with an employee and the role, and if you see the profile, this is the HBDI profile of a specific employee, and this is one of the examples that we had in the book, and then the actual role, so we created a quote-unquote pro forma profile of the job, so to speak. We saw that there was, you discovered that there's misalignment. This person was immensely frustrated. All of their time and energy was going into details that they absolutely hated to do, and they weren't performing well. So having that conversation, suddenly they realized that there was a way to shift some of that responsibility to another person and leverage some of the big picture thinking that this person was bringing to bear. And ultimately, this person became a real success story for that organization. Another example of a shift, and even if you might say, well, gee, that's kind of close, blue and green, again, great frustration on the part of this case of the manager who just didn't get why this person seemed to be so stuck in the details and unable to really focus on some of the critical analysis that needed to happen. So providing the tools and a way to visualize and understand where there's misalignment is really important. When you have an alignment gap, things show up like poor performance, low job satisfaction, insecurity, and high stress, all which impact the engagement issue, of course. So thinking managers can create connections and help align by providing and behaving in a whole brain perspective, using a whole brain approach, providing rationale and purpose, consistency, clarity, procedures, collaboration, development, values, strategy, direction, and possibility. They really need to be agile. They need to leverage their whole brains. And if we look at our data over the 30 years that we've been working, the most effective leaders actually do that. CEOs tend to be more naturally whole-brained because their work has always required it. But what's changed in the last decade is that this requirement is now shifting down to the director and manager level. And senior leaders, I think, play a role here in engagement because they need to be translating the vision, mission, and values down into goals, objectives, and strategies. And here's the challenge. Managers are often the bridge between those two. And so they are often finding themselves as part of that translation. So it puts an even greater burden on managers to communicate effectively, to translate some of those critical pieces into the actual objectives, goals, and strategy. And I think it's a big part. Doesn't take the senior leaders off the hook. They absolutely need to be communicating in as much of a whole brain way as they can. But I think the burden in today's world often falls on those managers who bridge that gap and really have an impact on the engagement piece. And finally, managers need to learn how to coach more effectively. Gosh, when you think about it, a decade ago we weren't talking about coaching, and now coaching is everywhere. And when we see that, a good coach helps, will make people see what they can be. And I think managers, if they're focusing on that employee and what they can be, that opportunity, the strengths piece, really understanding that development opportunity, that can go a long way in really helping not only that person understand what they can deliver, but also where they might need to stretch so that they too can leverage their whole brain, but always starting off with that strength-based approach. So finally, why, you might say, well, an interesting way to ask is, well, why might they not be engaging? So let's look at that from a whole brain perspective. They might think they're already engaged, or they don't know that they're supposed to be engaged differently. So I think we have a role in our profession to explain what engagement is. I think it might seem obvious to us what we mean by engagement. Let's make sure that we're explaining it clearly and that we've given people a clear enough set of data points to understand exactly what we mean. They may not know how to show that they're engaged or to demonstrate, that they're not engaged or when to do that. And, we want to know just as much when they're not engaged as when they are. And so here you might be able to develop them in a way that helps them understand what is it that we can do to help you better understand how do you talk to your manager, how do you have that conversation if you're not getting from your manager what you need. In the red, there may not be any positive consequences. Is there any, what's in it for me, right? And they may not even realize the effect on others for not being engaged. And so, as you look at that, that's an opportunity to connect using data points, providing them with an opportunity with their team to understand how they are affecting others, using tools like the HBDI or other tools. And yes, you will get a copy or an outline of the PowerPoint through our landing page. There was a quick question there I wanted to make sure you knew. So finally, as we look at the yellow, they don't know why. Why should I do this? Or they say, well, this is beyond my control. I think we need to inspire them and help them understand how this is going to help them and why there is value for them in terms of looking at their own development and their own growth. So I think we have a very important role to help managers move through this process. So keys for managers to individualize engagement: they need to own and be accountable for their thinking preferences. That is the first step. Obviously, awareness comes prior to owning, but once they have that awareness, they need to really own it. They need to value the thinking preferences of others and their strengths, and stretch to engage towards them so that they can better engage them in the way they need to be engaged. Help align work with preferences and employees with initiatives when they can, so that you can get that passion connection that is so critical to driving engagement in today's environment. And finally, coach to help others stretch and leverage their brain when we don't have that exquisite alignment. And we know that most roles don't allow for that exquisite alignment. So be there as a coach to help those that they work with really understand how they can better leverage what they bring to the table and stretch. And so as you look at that, have an opportunity to look at that value add that managers can really play. A quick example of an organization, Christiana Healthcare took the Gallup questions, and you might raise your hand if you're using the Gallup questions, the 12 questions that matter most, and they aligned them with the quadrants and saw that in fact they're pretty whole-brained. So one of the things that they did to get buy-in from their senior leaders was to say, you know what, if you begin to understand and begin to become more agile in your thinking preferences, you're going to hit more of these 12 more of the time. And so it was kind of an interesting way to get buy-in, and they got broad uptake of the use of thinking preferences, saw increased engagement not only with their leaders and their leaders internally, but they also saw their patient satisfaction scores go up. So a really great example of how you can bridge between some of these different components, make sure that you draw the link between your initiative and the ultimate results that you're trying to draw. So we have just a few minutes left to discuss this and to ask some questions. So let me hand it back to you, Sarah. I think there are a few questions here that we might want to tackle.
Yes, there is. Thank you so much. And we have probably 5 minutes for that live Q&A. So attendees, why don't you go ahead and submit those questions now into the chat box. And while we wait for those questions to come in, why don't I just share a little bit on how to keep in touch. On that slide, that is Anne's website, hermannsolutions.com, as well as their email and phone number are also listed on that slide. And you can always keep in touch with us through the regular social media networks, as well as register for our weekly Wednesday webinars at HRDQ-U.com. And we are also excited to announce we're hosting the first ever 5-day ROI Bootcamp at the end of April, and you can register for that at HRDQ-U.com. So, and we do have a number of questions coming in, so why don't we go ahead and get started? Looks like the first question is coming from Crystal. What are the strategies to engage managers to their role to think and value thinking employees?
So, okay. So as we think about that, I think this notion of the first step is, I think, helping them understand themselves. I think it always starts with self, and so I use that strategy with you. Every manager is also an employee and needing to be engaged themselves. And I think as you look at getting started, they may also have engagement challenges. They have had engagement challenges in their career. They are not just the purveyors of engagement, they're the receivers of engagement. So, and just the same way that I did with you, I think it's very useful to invite them first to think about what they need for engagement, what works for them, and to help them begin to understand that one size doesn't fit all, that what it feels like to be disengaged, what it can feel like to have that mismatch in terms of role, and then take it to the next level to say, well, just, okay, now that you understand that, now think about what that impact will be for those that are reporting to you. So I have a bias towards that because I believe that once they begin to understand their thinking, plus you get the bonus of their being educated in how they think first, and then you can then move towards getting them to own the responsibility for that. So that's certainly the way we've done it, and it's been a very effective way because you're addressing their needs first and then going to the needs of those that report to them versus just focusing on the people who are reporting to them. Hopefully that's helpful.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And it looks like we probably have time for just one more. This one's coming from George. What advice for guiding managers to stretch?
So the first step is, I think, first of all, making sure that they know that they can stretch. The mindset work by Carol Dweck is very powerful. Dweck, D-W-E-C-K. You first have to verify that they understand that they can actually change their thinking, that intelligence is not sort of hardwired for life and that we can't change. And if they don't, then you need to provide them with data that shows that they can. And then I think providing them with some of the what's in it for them in terms of why is engagement going to help them. They'll be able to see that work gets done faster, that they're getting that their goals are getting met faster. I think we make assumptions because we know why this is so important, and we have all of that data that other people know that. So you have to really build a business case for them because you're taking time out of their day, and they don't always realize that this is really important. And that they can actually move the needle themselves. So I think you have to build a business case and then make sure that they know that they can do it. And then finally, of course, provide the tools. Give them some specific tools they can use. We use the communication models, et cetera, as ways to do that. And I know we have an opportunity to send some answers by email. So I know the StrengthsFinder question came up, and we'll try to respond to that by email follow-up, Sarah, since that's probably a longer answer than I can provide today.
Okay, perfect. And Anne, would you just like to add any final thoughts before I go ahead and wrap up this session then?
Absolutely. I would just say, we all know what it takes to engage. And I think first and foremost, think about what you're doing to engage your leaders in this process, what you're doing to engage your managers. What do they need to hear from you? And then think about your program and diagnose it, and which quadrants are you hitting, and which ones might you be overlooking? And how can you leverage your own brain power to move the needle on engagement and have that kind of impact? Because we can all do it.
Yes, All right, perfect. Well, Anne, thank you so much again, and that is all the time we have for today. And if we did not get to your answer today, you will receive an emailed response to those answered questions probably about Wednesday of next week. So we appreciate your time, and we hope you found today's webinar informative.